After being dismissed as paranoid thinking and a conspiracy theory, the view that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus may have been a leak from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, has gained considerable traction among the scientific community. While the predominant view still remains that the coronavirus has a natural origin, there is a perceptible shift towards at least considering the possibility that it could well have been a laboratory leak. Among those passionately calling on the scientific community to keep an open mind since last year is Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, a well-known Australian immunologist and director of endocrinology at Flinders Medical Centre in Adelaide. Mayank Chhaya Reports spoke to Professor Petrovsky, who during this interview strongly pointed out how supremely human adapted the virus has been, signaling the possibility that it may have originated in a lab in China. Professor Nikolai Petrovsky.
In February this year, you were quoted as saying that there is little or limited evidence that the early transmission of the virus in China could have been linked to the cold chain or cold food chain rather. Is that still, and in the interim, much has changed. In fact, I'm sure you're one of the leaders of the thinking that the idea that it was a lab leak has picked up a lot of traction. What's your current thinking?
Yeah, so obviously a number of different explanations have been put forward, for the origins of this virus. The initial one, and certainly one we initially, like everyone else, thought is that this is a chance transmission, through some exotic animal species in China that's been in the markets and, has been infected and transmitted to humans. Then over time, there were quite a lot of unusual features about this virus that ourselves and others found that made us question that first possibility, and we had to go looking for other possibilities. And the second possibility, which seemed plausible and worthy of investigation, was that in fact this in some way had human intervention, and therefore this came to the whole lab leak or lab involvement in the virus. And of course the geography of the Wuhan Institute of Virology contributed to that, because is it a coincidence that the outbreak started right beside the only lab in the whole of China that was doing this type of research? But there were other more scientific reasons, not just the geography, that said maybe this is something we should look at. And then of course we had this sort of unusual proposition by the Chinese in the middle to late of last year, when the lab leak hypothesis was starting to get some traction. They came up with this what you might call third possibility, that the virus had been imported into China on frozen food. Of course, even if you accept that possibility, it still doesn't explain where did it come from to get onto the frozen food. So you're back to the natural animal origin, human intervention. It's just that you've now moved it out of China and taken the focus off China. So you would have to, accept that was quite ingenious, really, because it took all of the focus that was at that time on China and said, look somewhere else, look in the US or look in Europe, look in Southeast Asia. Why are you giving us such a hard time? But really no one, I think, bought that third possibility, maybe other than some of the members on the WHO panel who had visited China. But again, there were a lot of heavy conflicts of those individuals. But I think most scientists around the world, saw it as a distraction, because, when you look at the probabilities, certainly, if you have millions of contaminated food parcels, because you've got transmission in a lot of parts of the world going on, yes, there's a chance one of those food parcels might infect a worker. But if you postulate this was the cause of the virus, it meant that a pangolin, in Norway had to cough on one container, and a person had to touch that container and actually get infected, the probabilities are like billions to one, and so no one really took that seriously as an explanation for the original cause of this virus.
Right. Where does it leave us now, now that you've given me that background? Are we ever going to find out the origin of this virus in the near future or at all?
I think, at least, I'd say we've gone back to having an open mind. Given that no one has found the virus in the wild, that's very clear. Now, if they keep looking, maybe there is a possibility it will be found. Sometimes this isn't easy. That would give a definitive answer, of course, if we found the clear ancestors and we could demonstrate the linkage, like we did for the SARS coronavirus.
Right.
If that doesn't happen, of course, we always will need to consider the other possibility that, this was a lab leak. Now, will we find definitive evidence of that? Unlikely, unless someone actually, at some point, revealed, an experiment or what might have been, the cause. And that does happen. Sometimes after an interval of 10 or 20 years, information is disclosed because it's no longer that sensitive. So we know, for instance, the Russians had lab accidents that killed people during their bioweapons program, and they denied it for many years, and then eventually it all came out after the collapse of the Cold War. So we now know definitively, it was a lab leak, but of course they were never going to admit it at the time. So there is the possibility that, yes, if with enough time passing, if this was a lab leak, eventually someone will come out and actually reveal what really happened. But it may not happen, in the immediate future. It might be, in a decade's time.
Related to this, the numbers that the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker publishes every day. I'm looking at it right now. You're looking at some, in the Chinese case, 103,000 odd infections and little less than 5,000 deaths. Now, I'm baffled by that. First of all, isn't that suspiciously low, or do you think they've controlled it so well that they are the best in the world right now? How do you explain these figures?
Yeah, so what we know from a range of intelligence services is that total deaths from the early days of the outbreak is almost certainly a massive underestimate. I think there's been intelligence analysis of the number of cremations that were happening in Wuhan and surrounding areas from the smoke plumes that they put out. And from that, you can actually estimate, just how many people are dying. So I don't think anyone takes that total death number in China that seriously. It may be 3, 4, 5 times that during that first month or so before they brought the outbreak under control. But since then, it's very clear that with very strict social isolation and quarantine procedures, that not just China, but Australia, New Zealand have managed to effectively eradicate the virus. And of course, if you eradicate the virus, you have no further deaths. Right. And so for all 3 countries, in fact, all of our deaths occurred in that first 1 to 2 months before people got serious and said, look, we have to tackle this with very strict social isolation and quarantining. If that was done early, it was incredibly effective. And we know that we eradicated SARS from the whole globe, even once it had spread to multiple countries, just by quarantine and social isolation. That was all that was implemented. We didn't have a vaccine at the time for SARS, and we eradicated it from humanity. That is what should have happened with COVID-19. The fact it didn't happen is a major failure of a whole lot of global health systems that should have jumped in and protected us and didn't. So if we need investigations, it's not just into the origins of the virus, it's why was there such a terrible failed early response, not so much in China because they did respond, but in all the countries of the world around China who didn't respond in a strict or as quick a fashion, which may have eradicated COVID-19 if that had happened.
If this was indeed a lab leak, does it not follow that the scientific community should have had a better handle on how to counter it?
Yes, I think that the problem was outside of China. This issue got politicized very rapidly. By January, February, which was right when the world was learning about this outbreak at the time, because to be honest, the Chinese, were hiding and playing down this dramatically. So to be honest, most global leaders were not taking it seriously enough in January, February, when they should have been acting, closing borders, shutting down flights from China. That is what should have happened the minute they knew about this outbreak. But the problem, in January, February is, US was in a trade war with China, which was really hitting its peak. US was in a war with WHO, where they were essentially, removing their funding and walking away from WHO. So there were a lot of geopolitical things happening, which was just unfortunate timing, but it meant that no one was really focused on the big issue was, here is a potential global pandemic about to start. Instead they were all focused on how to take advantage of this, how to point the finger at someone else. And so that's why we had this disastrous situation where even scientists who should have been, studying the virus and trying to understand where it was coming from, were saying, President Trump has said it's a lab leak. We're not even going to contemplate that possibility. We're going to shut our minds to that scientific possibility, which means scientists can't operate properly. If scientists have closed minds, that's the end of science. And yet that's what we saw for the whole of last year is this mindset of politicization of what were really scientific questions.
Right. Is it your sense now that the world is perhaps coming around, the scientific community rather, coming around to the view that you've advanced for a while? They are at least seriously looking at the lab leak possibility in a scientific way. Yeah,
well, I think what happened is not that the science changed, it was the politics changed. Obviously, the US is, got a new administration. Suddenly, people were happy to listen to what was there all along. I mean, even the US intelligence services had been saying, we shouldn't dismiss this possibility, but everyone was ignoring them because they thought the intelligence services were an instrument of President Trump, which clearly they weren't. And so I think scientists now, in a way, have woken up to the fact that they actually were bluffed into taking a position which was not scientific. And so now I think, embarrassingly, they've all had to do backflips and try one way or another to reset their position to what would be a proper scientific position, which is, all possibilities are on the table until we have very clear evidence that, we can include or exclude one of those possibilities. So scientists were behaving badly last year, that, and on a global basis. I mean, we're talking millions of scientists here who were behaving badly. Now Most of them have come to their senses, fortunately, and I think now we've got a proper open dialogue on just, what are the possibilities whereby this virus started.
Did I read it right that you personally had a lot of challenges in terms of getting a magazine of the stature of Nature to look at what you were talking about seriously? Took you a lot of effort.
Yeah, so we do a lot of supercomputer modeling of viruses because we design vaccines against pandemic viruses, and we've been doing that for 20 years, and receive a lot of our funding, in fact, from the US National Institutes of Health. So we are sort of world leaders in that area. And back in January last year, we used our supercomputers to analyze the COVID virus because we knew nothing about it at the time. So we used our supercomputers to build models of the virus to understand where it might have come from, which species was the likely origin, with a very open mind. In fact, we thought we would find a zebra or a pangolin or some animal that would explain the outbreak. So certainly at that point in time, we had no suspicion that this might be a lab leak. Our view, like everyone else, was this had come from an animal. And the modeling rapidly, showed us a very unusual feature, which is that this virus actually was designed as a human virus. It was optimized for infecting humans, not for infecting any of the animals that we studied. So that was what really threw us, and we thought, well, that's unusual for a new virus. It shouldn't be that well adapted. And so we put all that data together, and starting in about May last year, which was still very early, submitted this to a whole range of leading scientific journals who'd been publishing data from the Chinese on the origins of the virus, thinking, we're not saying, we think this is very important information, but we can't interpret it. We can say there are different possibilities, but we were trying to be very neutral and just saying, here's important modeling data. And every journal we sent it to, within a day said, this is too hot, we're rejecting it, we're not going to publish it, we're not even going to review it. And this, we went round and round and round, and eventually we decided we'd submit it to Nature Scientific Reports, because Nature had been publishing all of these papers from Chinese and also US investigators, dismissing the possibility of a laboratory leak. Now, our paper didn't say this is a laboratory leak, but we thought it gave an interesting insight to add to the papers they'd already published. And we did eventually get them to send it for review, and we went through 2 or 3 rounds of review, which is a lot of review for a normal paper. And then suddenly we got a rejection. And we thought, we've been stalled for 6 months and now they're rejecting it after we've addressed all the reviewers' comments. So we appealed the rejection, and after a few months they agreed that they would send it back for review for yet another round of review. And so we've now been through, I think, 3 more rounds of review, and finally just last week they accepted the paper for publication. Now, I don't believe that, for an important paper on a pandemic topic that gave new insights and was very open-minded in what those insights might mean, I don't think it deserved that type of treatment. And the fact that we were basically stopped from publishing it for a year, which meant that, it didn't have credibility because, everyone said it's not been peer-reviewed, it hasn't passed peer review. And so that sort of makes it very hard to communicate that information to people. So we were prevented from giving one side of the story for 12 months. And so we're wondering, why was that? What was going on that meant we weren't allowed to share the story? And I think that's another serious question, is what was the role of all of the major publishers in this very biased reporting of what was happening with the virus and where it may have come from. And that's a major concern, because scientific journals shouldn't be political, and they should, again, publish all sides of the story.
Absolutely. Yeah. A couple of things jumped out at me in your response just now. One, you said it's designed for rather unusual adoption by humans. Uh, that's a startling thing. I don't think people realize the import of what you're just saying. Could you
Yeah, look, I
tell me
mean,
a
and
little more
I
about
think,
that?
yeah, so again, it's, we're not the, we've done this independently, and other people have done other types of analysis quite different to what we've done, including, studying the virus in the laboratory. And again, some of these people are actually Chinese scientists,
I see.
and across the board, all of the results agree that this virus, was just supremely well adapted to infect humans from day one. Now, what we know about SARS and pandemic flu, all of these other viruses that have caused pandemics, is at the time they've moved from an animal to a human, they've been very weak. And sometimes it can take months, if not years, before they become so strong in humans that they can cause, a global pandemic. So basically they cross over in a weak state because they don't know humans. They have to adapt as they adapt and they slowly, build strength, then they take off. This virus took off day one. It's very clear from the very first human that got infected, this was ready to spread human to human and cause a global pandemic. And that's not, again, as I say, that is just not typical of a pandemic virus that's crossed over from an animal species. Right. So, then you have to go back and say, how did it become so perfectly human adapted? Was it a chance thing? Well, that's 1 billion to 1. I mean, viruses are complex, genetic structures.
Right.
It's unlikely that all the genes of the virus were all designed to match, human cell physiology.
Right.
So then the only explanation is either this virus has been in humans for years and we didn't know about it. And of course, there's absolutely zero evidence of that. I would say negative evidence of that, because people have looked for traces of the virus in human samples, and there's no evidence of it. So if it wasn't in humans before, then the only possibility we could come up with is it was in human cells in either a laboratory dish, and we know most labs, including the labs in Wuhan, regularly grow viruses with human cells, causing adaptation to humans. Or potentially it was experiments done in humanized mice, because these days, in fact, ever since SARS, in order to study SARS in mice, because it doesn't normally infect mice, and nor does COVID, people made these humanized mice where the mice express the human ACE2 protein. And that now allows you to grow the virus in the mice. But in doing so, the virus is actually adapting to a human receptor that you've put in the mice. And so again, you could end up with a humanized virus that's come from a bat that now, for instance, is perfectly adapted to infect humans. So that's where we would postulate that there must have been some, intervention where this virus was actually being grown on either human cells or in humanized mice. That seems the most logical explanation for its adaptation. It may still be a fluke event from nature, so we can't discount that, but it's quite plausible that this was actually a human-adapted virus from a laboratory.
Last couple of things. One is the idea that it is so perfectly human adapted. Where does it leave us with the variants now?
Yeah, and again, people say, oh, the variants prove it wasn't perfectly human adapted, and that's simply not true. I mean, if we look at the first 6 months of this virus, it really didn't change at all. And again, as I explained before, if it's a new virus in humans, you'll typically see a massive number of mutations in that first 3 to 6 months through adaptation, because it's building strength. This virus didn't mutate at all over those first, months when it was infecting millions of people, because it didn't need to. Right. It was already super efficient. Now, if a virus is replicating in tens and hundreds of millions of people, it's inevitable that some, additional mutations will occur, and some of those mutations will give it a bit better advantage over the previous forms. And so that doesn't mean it wasn't already perfectly human adapted. It's now just finding some tweaks and go-arounds as it moves forward. And again, that is not surprising. And in fact, the rate of mutation is very low. But obviously, there are these key mutations that make it even more challenging to deal with. So, as I say, it doesn't disprove the fact that it was already incredibly well human adapted before it started, but now it's found a few more tricks. Obviously, with the variants, like influenza, the more we push back against the virus, the more it will try to find go-around solutions. So the more we vaccinate, or the more people have immunity because they've been infected before, the more the virus will try and find mutations that it allows it to escape that immune response. And again, viruses are designed to survive. So whatever we do to try and crush the virus, it will try to find a countermeasure. And so this is quite normal. What we have to do is use overwhelming force against the virus, so basically it doesn't have a chance, and then we win the battle, and we extinguish the virus. And we've done that with smallpox, we've done that with polio. So it is possible if we take a concerted effort, not just to get rid of the original virus, but to get rid of the variants as well.
And finally, on the question of India, since the variant mentioned in the Indian context is said to be particularly transmissible, where do you think India is headed now? Is there anything that India can do to come out of this massive mess?
Well, vaccination is ultimately the key. The way the vaccination works is one, obviously, it hopefully protects the person who gets vaccinated against serious illness and death. But the other way it works is it reduces the transmissibility of the virus. And, in the early days of the virus, everyone, was talking about R0, the number of people infected by an infected person. Mm-hmm. And if the R0 falls below 1, the virus extinguishes. And so everything, you do, say in a country like Australia, by social isolation, quarantining, we were able to break that R0 of the original strain of the virus just below 1. It disappeared, right? Yeah. If you have it just above 1, it will continue to exponentially expand and will never go away. So that remains true to this day. And so the whole strategy of the vaccine is to actually reduce the transmissibility of the virus. It may only do it by 50%, but if the R0 in India currently is 2, and you vaccinate 50% of the people, and that drops the R0 just below 1, again the virus is actually going to self-extinguish. And so the vaccines by themselves, may not fully protect, they may not fully stop infections. But what they are doing is dropping the R0, and that's why you have to combine vaccination with other strategies like quarantine, social isolation. A vaccine will not work if you just think we're going to vaccinate everyone and then they should just continue to mix and transmit. You might end up with a situation where you've dropped the R0 from 2.5 to 1.5. You haven't solved the problem. In fact, you're going to encourage, ironically, if you do that, you're going to encourage more variants.
I see. Okay.
Because if you're put like a choke on the virus to get it down to an R naught of 1.5, the virus is going to now start looking for solutions because it's still replicating. If you can use your vaccine and social isolation, get the R naught below 1, the virus doesn't have a chance because it's going to rapidly self-extinguish.
Right.
And of course, as it self-extinguishes, it has very little chance to find a useful variant mutation. And so really the world, should accept for the next year, in combination with vaccination, ironically, we probably should be doing more aggressive social isolation and quarantine to eradicate the virus from our country, just like Australia's done. I think we'll start to see countries like Israel, hopefully they'll understand being vaccinated gives an opportunity, but it will backfire if they don't use that as a tool to eradicate the virus. Because while the virus continues to circulate, it can come up with new solutions that get around the vaccine, and then we're back to square one, and we don't want to be in that situation. So I think, again, the world and India and other countries need to accept we've still got a way to go. We've got some great tools in the vaccines. We now understand the virus behavior a lot better. Let's go all out and see if we can't eradicate this virus. And that solves the whole problem. Like in Australia, we don't wear masks. Why? Because we don't have the virus.
Right, remarkable. I think we are over by a minute. I want to end it. I know you have other things. Thank you so much for your time, Professor, and I'll send you the video link soon.
Okay, great.